Hi, everybody. This is the Snap No Tap podcast. I'm Joe Cardinal.
Tony Cecchine.
This is Nico, and we're here with my brother AJ, who works dispatch 911, and we're gonna interview him and ask him some questions. So, what's up, AJ?
Hey, how you doing?
How you doing, AJ?
All right.
All right.
So, how's everything going with 911?
It's been an interesting year, to say the least, between the pandemic and riots and things of that nature, but business as usual.
Are they burning down the city by you?
No, nothing like that. There's we got a small group out here that's the abolitionist group is what they call themselves, but they've remained pretty peaceful. They had one night of rioting and things like that. I don't necessarily know if it was that group, but it was at the end of May. One bad night, and then aside from that, they're holding protests and rallies, and that's about it.
So, there hasn't been much looting out there?
No, no, surprisingly. Typically a pretty violent town here, but they've remained. They're decent. They're a decent group.
So, how about the violence? Has it gone up or down, or is it about the same since all this happened?
Uh, it depends on what time frame we're looking at. Like I haven't noticed that big of a difference between this year and any other year, but I mean the concealed carry in Illinois really is the only thing that dropped the violence. It was the only thing that I noticed that dropped the violence. I know initially when the actual lockdown started, or the 15 days to slow the spread that we're 6 months into now, there was an uptick in violence, and I think that's more or less gang related. If you got a beef to settle, what better time than when you know that somebody's at home?
Yeah. So, is the violence going down with the weather cooling off, or is it maintaining right now?
Right now it's maintaining, but we'll see. Normally, once people start getting into the swing of things with school and everything like that, it'll tend to slow down a little bit.
So, what's like I would say your most you get called the most on, and what type of violence is like the most prevalent, would you say?
Domestic violence for sure.
And is it usually like just a man beating a woman, or is there weapons involved, or
A lot of the times it is man beating a woman. Sometimes there is weapons involved. There's also, and I can't say that this is, anything that is predominant in any other city except for the one that I work for. But we have a huge population of mental illness, and a lot of that tends to feed into it.
so did you get a lot of calls from mentally ill people with like, they're calling about things that don't exist?
Yeah, we have actually quite a few regulars that, one that calls every single day, multiple times a day. You answer the phone because we do 911 and non-emergency, so it's like she's at least good and she doesn't tie up a 911 line, but she calls non-emergency and everybody knows who she is, so she's just hi. You answer the phone and like just goes into, I just woke up and I'm having this for breakfast, and she sees some weird things too. Very weird things. It makes it fun while you're training the new people and their eyes get all big and yeah, okay, just keep talking.
So as far as the gang violence, do you guys have a lot of gang violence out there?
Yeah, we're because of the fact that we're like a nice hub right in between Madison, Milwaukee, and Chicago. We get a lot of that overflow, I guess, or the in between stuff.
So are you taking calls that are like gunshot calls or stabbings or all
Yep.
kinds of stuff?
Yep, all that. I mean, it. I'd say the gunshot is more prevalent than the stabbings.
Wow.
Yeah, we get a lot of robberies, a lot of ag assault, when somebody's just threatening them with a weapon. And you'd be surprised, man, a lot of it's between neighbors.
Oh, that don't surprise me.
It's astounding, man. It's like I never would have thought.
Hey, can we start at the beginning? How long have you been in law enforcement and what got you interested in it or why did you decide to pursue that as a career?
I've been doing 911 for 10 years now. Initially, I started off, I was going to school for firefighting. Law enforcement and that aspect of it, especially being behind the microphone, never really occurred to me until my wife was pregnant with our first child, and that was what they were posting availability for. So that's what I applied for, and I've been there ever since. I actually, surprisingly, coming from the fire aspect of things, I actually love the law enforcement side of things.
What's the difference? What do you like about it that's different between the two?
Well, at least from my perspective, where being in control of everything and kind of directing things and making sure that the guys and gals that are going to these calls have what they need. Um, the law enforcement side from the dispatch perspective is a lot busier, a lot busier. I'd be bored out of my mind on the fire side of things, where it's just you send them to a call and that's about it.
How many calls do you get in a shift?
It varies. The law enforcement side, we're trying to think. The last time I was at work, we were at 95,000 on the year. So it's normally, it depends on the day. Normally it's if I'm dispatching, it's probably close to 100.
So what is it the busiest on weekends or nights?
Actually, it's anymore. It seems to be the weekdays.
At nighttime or during the day?
During the day anymore.
Wow.
It used to be like when I first started and I was on nights. Nights was busy on the weekends. Every single Saturday, you'd have the same crowd at the same bars, and it was wild actually thinking back to it. Like the officers would call you ahead of time, and they'd be like, "Hey, we're sitting on this group that's out here. We're probably going to be 1078, which is officer needs assistance." And just give us a heads up. And there were squad cars getting rammed every weekend. There was this. It was honestly like cornering animals. And then they'd go from whatever bar they were at, and then they'd stop at every single gas station. So as dispatch, we'd have that going on, multiple chases, and then we'd have to call all the gas stations and tell them to shut down their pumps because the group was heading their way. And it was weird. Like you build a rapport with the clerks that work weekend nights. It's like they would just know.
So would you say that it's key to have rapport and trust from the people around these prevalent of violent areas so
Yeah,
they can inform you guys and kind of work with you guys as a team?
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, and that's what, I don't know, with everything in the news, it kind of, I have a one-sided biased opinion about certain things, but I try to open up my perspectives and see. But most everybody knows we are funded by the citizens. We don't get paid unless it is for the citizens, and we understand the job that we're doing is for the citizens.
Do you think that the hatred of the cops as large, do you think it's justified, or you think it's just blown out of proportion?
It's blown way out of proportion, in my opinion. I mean, it's people don't realize that most every single police department is not going to be staffed correctly because politics has entered, the whole spectrum of things. So no mayor, no city council member, no village president, however it goes, wants to admit that crime is high. So they're always going to undersell the actual crime stats. And because of that, every police department is going to be short. So most of these calls, it's a call in from a citizen that the police, once they are assigned that call, have a legal obligation that they have to investigate it. I don't think people realize that. They think that the police are just out bothering people, and it's like, no, most of the time it's calls. It's people calling in and making a complaint or saying that there's a suspicious person, and once the officers have that call assigned to them, they have to, well, legally, they have to investigate it, which I don't think legally they should, but, you know, then you'll have the other end of the spectrum saying that the police aren't doing anything.
It's like a catch-22.
It is. It is. And I think most people would be surprised at the call volume of their local 911 center, because it's a lot higher than even I realized, knowing that the city I work for is high crime. And when I walked onto the job, I was astounded at the amount of calls that we have.
Yeah, I noticed the stats, like when they released the stats for the shootings for the weekend in Chicago. I know those are highly skewed because, like, for example, one weekend they said we had 50 shootings in the city this weekend. And I talked to somebody that worked at a hospital in Chicago, and they said, well, we had at least 50 gunshot victims come in this particular hospital that weekend. So, I mean, the numbers got to be greatly diminished from what they're actually saying as to what the true number is.
There's a lot of that actually goes on because of the fact that politics has entered emergency services, which it has no business being in there.
Yeah, but you know, it also could be, I mean, because Chicago has a lot of bordering suburbs. So let's just say the shooting took place in, I'll just make up, you know, let's say Berwyn, but they go to a Chicago hospital. Okay, so technically the shooting didn't happen in Chicago. It happened in Berwyn, but they may have been treated in Chicago. Now, I'm not saying that's the case in what you're referring to, Nico, but that is a possibility. You know, like for example, where I live now, the city that I live doesn't actually have a hospital. I got to go to another city to get to the hospital. So, you know, that would skew it.
That's accurate. That's very accurate. And even if I know Chicago would do this because this is my department, this is what they do. So say it was a shooting that occurred in Berwyn, but they went to a Chicago hospital, we would then have the hospital call Berwyn Police Department to send somebody to come take the report, because it where the crime happened, not where it ended up,
Yeah.
but where it happened is who gets the credit for it.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I remember years ago, I was briefly dating. Well, I dated a couple Chicago police officers, but I was also dating a paramedic, and it was the kind of, like, to change the subject, but the paramedic calls, sometimes they were nonstop. Okay, I mean, just one call after the next, after the next, after the next. Now in Chicago, the paramedics and firefighters are different. In a lot of the suburbs out here, they're both. You're a firefighter and a paramedic or an EMT. So man, like those paramedic calls were like off the charts, you know, one after the other. But fire calls were not, you know, depending on where you're at, what firehouse, you know, they weren't as you know, prevalent. But yeah, it's statistics are, you know, can be misinterpreted or purposely skewed. We know that both ways, good or pro and con, you know.
I think those EMTs are like probably the most underpaid professionals. They do so much. I mean, especially in Chicago, they're running. I don't know what their shift is, but I know they're running like all night, especially on the weekends, because I did some volunteer work with them, and it's no joke, man. I think they should be paid a lot more than what they get paid.
Well, I don't know what it is now, but I thought their shifts were like firemen, 24 on and 48 off and so on. But I mean, I'm out of the loop now, so I don't know. You know, I remember running into a lieutenant, this is back a ways. He, Villa Park.
I'm getting some background noise.
Yeah, I don't know who's. Check and see if that's your mic. Mute yourself a minute, AJ.
I just muted myself.
Yeah, so it's AJ's.
Oh, okay. Got some background noise on that.
Well, the Villa Park, and I was talking to I don't remember, I think he was a lieutenant. I'm like, when's the last fire call you were on? And he's like, over a year ago. You know, the fire calls, especially with modern building techniques and, you know, sprinklers and so on and construction, you know, the fire calls aren't like they used to be. But the paramedic calls, or whatever you want to call it, EMT health related calls, are you know, obviously more prevalent. I mean, it just. But again, too, with Chicago, you have to remember something, and this is, I think, gets lost in all of this. Chicago has the third largest population in the United States of America, third largest. Okay, so I think people they overreact when they see X amount of shootings or this or that. You know, we're pushing close to 3 million people, you know, 2.6, I believe, in the city proper. And then add the greater Chicagoland area, you're pushing close to 9 million people. Yeah, I know that outright they have probably more killings or shootings than New York or LA, which is number one and number two population wise. But still, like AJ, you know, his town is a far cry from the population of Chicago, yet you heard him say it's a violent, crime-ridden town. Per capita, it may be worse than Chicago. I don't know the stats, but Chicago is not number one per capita for crime in America. It's not even close. That I do know.
AJ, do you know the stats on that? Like per capita with crime in your town and Chicago and the others?
It varies because it's an annual thing. I know that Chicago is typically within the top 30. My town is typically within the top 5.
Wow.
There you go. That's
pretty rough. You live in the hood.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes my job fun though. I mean, I can't say fun because there are tragedies that happen in there, but you know, on a day-to-day basis, I actually like being busy. I like you know, the action and the experience.
How does a typical call go? Because it sounds like you've got so many calls, you can't stay on a call necessarily, right? So like if you hear something, oh, you know, such and such is having an incident, you dispatch it and then you have to move on to the next one. So do you necessarily even hear how that plays out or what happens? Or do you get feedback afterwards saying, oh, this would have been better, or this is how it unfolded? I mean, or is it most of the time you're just getting glimpses of what's occurring?
That's pretty much it. I mean, on the street, I know they're taught to treat every single incident as though it's an unknown problem. You know, when I first started, people were, you know, like at the 911 center, we don't dispatch and take calls at the same time, which is nice. A lot of departments do that, but we have dedicated call takers and dedicated dispatchers. So essentially half of my shift, and we work 12-hour shifts. So half of my shift, I'm going to be on phones. The other half, I'm going to be on dispatch. But you don't. You get a very small glimpse of whatever is going on. Normally, it's only a one-sided story, so who knows what the truth is. When I first started, people were a lot better about calling in. Now they seem to think that everything that they see on CSI is accurate, and that as soon as they call, we know exactly where they're at. And, you know, they just send the police and hang up.
So when you get a call, you guys don't know the address or nothing?
And no. We can do, it's called, you know, some calls come in as phase 1, which is essentially just a cell phone tower. then you can try to rebid and get a phase 2 location, but those phase 2 locations are more accurate than phase 1, but they're not. I mean, you can call a cell phone company and get a trace, and they'll tell you, they'll be like, oh yeah, we got phase 2, but it's accurate within 1,500 meters. It's a big, big area, 1,500 meters. Like, and trying to narrow that down in a neighborhood, good luck.
Yeah, that's almost a mile, so it's not an enhanced 911 system you're operating with, correct?
We are enhanced. That's the sad thing, is that we are.
Okay.
And we're just rolling out this month. We're starting the next gen 911, which is the texting and videos and all that good stuff.
Interesting. Yeah, it's, I'm old enough to remember when they started the 911 system. So yeah, it's, I remember you can even watch old television shows like from the 50s or 60s or whatever, and say, operator, get me the police. They'd have to dial 0 for the operator, Now on this calls, if I would assume, like, if it's a life threatening, like, that there's a life being threatened here, either suicidal or you can hear commotion in the background, wouldn't you then stay on the line until the officers arrived on the scene?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, especially with anything that's life threatening, we would put in as say an in progress type call.
Okay.
Just because it gets the dispatcher's attention. Anything where it's like a burglary or something that's in progress, I think someone's breaking into my house, or so and so's here and they've got a gun, we do try to keep them on the phone the whole time, because it's the officers are going to have different things that they want to know outside of like a routine call. Suicidal people especially, we like on an in progress, the dispatcher will take over the 911 call. Just so that there's a direct connect from the police officers to the person that's on the phone. Where like a suicidal person, the call taker will keep them on the phone because they've already built that rapport with them, and we don't want anything messing with that.
That's interesting. Very, very interesting. Yeah, so a little psychology comes into play there. That's cool. Yeah. How would it work? Like you can watch the news sometimes and you can have a smaller suburb, right? Or even parts of Chicago, like that are on the edge of another city. And they'll recruit other fire departments to come, let's say in a case of a fire. How often does that happen that you or your department would have to recruit fire departments from different communities?
It actually happens pretty frequently. It's called MABUS, which is Mutual Alarm Box, or Mutual Aid. I apologize, Mutual Aid Box Alarm System. So most of the time, these departments will have intergovernmental agreements with these other departments and stuff that, let's say when you hear it on the news, it's a 5th alarm fire. A 5th alarm means that they've raised the fire to the 5th alarm. And they've got cards that are all preset, and they've got the whole agreements already on deck, so that dispatch will go pull the card and see, okay, well, we got to contact this agency to send a ladder, this agency to send an engine. They even do exchange quarters and things like that, so that the whatever city is getting hit with that fire, that they're not without fire protection for everybody else. So they'll have a neighboring fire department come and sit at their station and respond to calls for them, any other calls that come in.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, I never would even have thought about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think where I live now, there's 2 fire departments. There may be 3 that I know that they built a new firehouse a couple years ago, but I think that's because they're supposed to be building up new homes here. But I'm divided by a lake, so I know that there's a fire department on the west side of the lake, which I've never been over there. And there's one here, but I don't, and like I said, there's 3, but I don't know if the one is actually in my town anymore. It could be unincorporated or, what have you. But yeah, I don't even know if they're a volunteer fire department, to tell you the truth. I don't think so. I don't think so. But yeah, it's interesting. I was raised in a big city, in an inner city, so everything that happened was strictly Cleveland police or Cleveland, ambulance, emergency squad. Um, and of course, living in Chicago, same thing. You have the city itself come out, but so that's great, man. It's pretty interesting to hear all this stuff. Are you?
AJ,
Oh, go ahead.
oh, sorry, Tony. I had a question because I remember you told me about that you guys had a program where you actually put the cops in a house in like these rough areas and how it's proved to be really successful for the department. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so my department has there's two of them currently, and they've essentially just gone through stats and things like that, and it found the areas where there's increased issues. Let's say, so they got a couple houses, and they have two full-time police officers living in those houses. They've it's actually a sweet deal for the officers too. Like if you're one of these younger guys or gals and you pay no rent, you just got to pay for your internet, your cable, and that's it. But they get out and they engage in the community in those neighborhoods, and they actually do a really good job at it, and it has helped a lot to bring a lot of the crime stats down, because it's a lot of the times that communication comes into everything, and a lot of times, like especially the neighborhood problems and things like that, the issues with your neighbors, it's a lot, 9 times out of 10 it's a miscommunication. Sometimes it's just a crazy person or somebody that just wants to be an ass, but a lot of it is miscommunication and things like that. And I feel that they call them the rock house officers, and I think they do a good job of bridging that gap and just working out those issues and things like that. And it's lowered the call volume a lot in those neighborhoods.
So let me ask this. So you work an 8-hour shift then? I mean, how does this, I mean, or do they rotate? I mean, 24 hours, there's a cop on duty in the house, or I don't get it.
No, it's full-time person that lives in that house, and they work their normal shifts, but everybody in the neighborhood also knows that they're all given their phone number and things like that. So if they're having an issue, they're supposed to call them.
At any hour of the day or night?
Pretty much.
See, well, that could be tough though too. Imagine, you get a call at 2:00 in the morning.
Yeah.
See, now this is opening up a lot of questions for me now. Okay, let me ask this. Okay, let's say you work from 9 to 5. That's your shift. Just to keep it simple. Somebody calls you at 10:00 at night, and you end up spending 2 hours with this situation. Do you get paid for that?
I would assume that they do. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. See, that's like Chicago has like known neighborhoods or areas. Edison Park, Sauganash. I think, what's the one, Mount Greenwood or something on the far south side. I don't know that area well at all, but this is like a conglomeration of police officers or fire department, fire people. And yeah, those neighborhoods do tend to be, lower crime areas. I mean, it's not the setup that you're talking about. These are just officers that, because in Chicago, if you're a city worker, you absolutely have to live in the city. So these are just on their own. They decide to move into this area or that area. So how many houses like this you said are set up too?
Yeah, they've got to.
That's interesting. An interesting concept.
Yeah. And I think like for us, because the city itself is not very big, geographically it's not very big. So I think for smaller departments and things like that, I think it works, and it'll, I hope they actually expand it. A place like Chicago, it would be almost impossible to introduce any kind of program like that because the city's just too big.
Is there a residency requirement for you guys?
Well, they're trying, but no.
Okay. Well, Yeah, like the county, I have friends that are county sheriffs, Cook County sheriffs, and they do not have to live even in the county. You know, they could live wherever they want to live. But the Chicago thing goes beyond the fire department and police officers. It's any city worker. You know, you could be in the park district or a garbage truck or whatever. You've got to live in the city. I mean, people try to get around that. They get caught. It's, trouble. But yeah, Chicago was also thinking about, well, I don't know Chicago per se, but certain people were trying to get rid of that so they could get other people in, qualified people that may not want to live in the city for whatever reason. But that didn't pass, I don't believe. So I'm not astute enough to weigh in on the pros and cons of that. But when you have a city of 2.6 million people, you would think you should be able to recruit enough quality workers without having to go somewhere else. Be different if the town was a city of 1,000 people. You may not have great qualifications out of that. You won't have the talent pool, I guess, is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, but specifically with, let's say, police work, they're struggling everywhere to get police officers.
Yeah,
Everywhere struggling, whether you're able to recruit from a different agency or not, because everybody sees, on top of you're putting your life on the line for certain situations, but now you're putting your life on the line with armchair quarterbacks who you're going to get persecuted for one wrong move. I know it's taken its toll on all the police departments I'm familiar with, because they're just having a hard time of getting people in. Nobody's interested in the job anymore.
I can see how that would be problematic a little bit too. Like if you live in the city where you're basically creating a lot of enemies,
Yep.
that would seem to be a little bit unsafe. I mean, if they figure out where you live, that could be it.
Yep.
So
And there is logic behind having your police officers and your firefighters and your city employees invested in the city because they live in the community, and I understand that. Personally, I think a lot of it comes down to the cities just trying to get some of their money back, and by way of property taxes. That's where I think because to me, there's no logical excuse to force your employees to live in a certain place. I don't live in the city that I work for, but it doesn't make me care any less about the community. It doesn't make me care any less about the job that I'm doing.
So if, let's say you are a cop in Chicago and you live in Chicago, do they put you in a different area when you're working than the area that you live?
I'm not sure about Chicago. I know like our department, I can't speak on that. I don't know, because the city I work for, they don't have the residency requirements. I would assume more than likely though, it's they get to go in seniority order and choose what area they want to work at every year on an annual basis.
You're correct. You can put in, like I had a friend of mine who was on the tail end of his career. He's since passed away. But yeah, the last several years or few years of his career, he got assigned to O'Hare Airport, which was great. But yeah, that's exactly it. Sometimes these guys will put in for certain, districts that they choose to be in, which is kind of, again, cool seniority based. I don't know, but you do have to stay within wherever you live. It's got to be within the city limits. I mean, you get caught, you're in trouble. I had a friend of mine who was a fireman, and part of the northwest side of Chicago has a zip code that's shared with Elmwood Park. Okay, same zip code. So him and I had the same zip code, and they sent out an investigator to check it out. Because they're like, 60097, that's coming up Elmwood Park, but it's actually part of Chicago as well. So they actually came to his house, and, he had to go through not a big to do, but he had to, actually prove that, yeah, this is this is a Chicago address. So I don't know why or how somebody may have tipped them off, or they randomly, I don't know. But yeah, it's interesting. But yeah, I don't know how I would feel. I mean, I wouldn't, like, on the flip side, I knew someone who got married to a woman at the time was going through the state police thing. And once she graduated, she got assigned downstate Illinois. And he's like, man, I don't like this. Okay. I mean, imagine being put anywhere in the state. Illinois is a big state geographically. I mean, it's not Texas or Alaska or anything, but yeah, that would kind of stink. So yeah, I don't know. I just like to be able to be free to live where I want to live if I can, you know.
Yeah, the state police, they're almost like militant how they are with that, and that's
Yeah.
I think they've got, I don't even want to guess. They've got a lot of districts in Illinois too, so it's like you could be sent anywhere in the state, and I think most state police, Indiana, Wisconsin, all of them, it's the same thing. Once they finish their academy training, they're just assigned to go somewhere.
Yeah, a friend of mine is a retired Illinois State Police officer. He couldn't wait to get out of Illinois. He's gone now. Not dead, but he moved like 2 years ago. But yeah, I could not do, the job itself is one thing, but it's like, where am I going to live? You know, I don't want to live in the boonies somewhere. I mean, like where I'm at now, I mean, it's rural, but I'm not that far from Chicago. I can get there in an hour, you know, roughly. So yeah, I would be really, I don't know if for me personally, I couldn't deal with that. But yeah, that's another thing. When I moved to Chicago, okay, so this is interesting. When I was born and raised in Cleveland, I left Cleveland when I was 23. Unless I was on the Ohio Turnpike, I never saw state police. Okay. They just didn't do it. All I ever saw was Cleveland police, or if I went to a suburb, Euclid police or whatever. When I first moved to Chicago, I was blown away because I moved to the Northwest side immediately, which for those who don't know, that's roughly near O'Hare Airport. So I saw Chicago police everywhere, Cook County sheriffs everywhere, Illinois State Police because of the highways everywhere. And then you saw the Forest Preserve Police everywhere. And then O'Hare, the airport, had their own like police separate from Chicago, but like customs police. And there was another agency that I can't recall right now. I was blown away by this. I'm like, my God, there's law enforcement literally everywhere, which, now where I live, it's more county police that I see, the sheriff's department. I do see local police, but that's it. I don't even remember the last time now out here that I've seen state police, and I don't see any, obviously, airport police. I'm nowhere near the airport, but you'd be surprised how many, law enforcement agencies there are. I'm sure there's plenty that I'm not even aware of. You'd probably know more about that, AJ.
Yeah, there's so I mean, it just kind of depends on the layout of your county. Because like where I'm at, we've got county, we've got park district, we've got the city that I work for, and there's, trying to remember now, there's 14 different agencies just within the county.
Wow.
And then we've got a pretty sizable jail here. So pretty much the surrounding counties, a lot of them will use our jail, or they have court down by us, so they're driving through and they're in marked squads, or even if that county has a jail and we have their prisoner, then they send somebody to come pick them up. And so I mean, there's numerous different departments, and it really is incredible to see the bureaucracy of everything.
Yeah, I'll bet. And I'm sure there's some interdepartmental rivalries. I know that there's some that exist in Chicago. One friendly, I guess, rivalry is the Chicago, I don't know if they're still holding this, but the boxing. between the police department and the fire department. Every year they would hold the inner, well, I don't want to say intramural, but whatever, interdepartmental boxing tournaments. But yeah, there's some kicks with, Chicago police versus Cook County sheriffs, and even within the sheriff's department. And hopefully one of these days we'll have my friend, that's a county sheriff. We'll have him on if he'd like to be on. I want to ask him. There's you got like the bailiffs, then you have sheriff's police, and then just regular county sheriffs. There's within the Cook County Sheriff's Department, there's different, corrections officers. So yeah, boy, when you start putting this all together, it can be quite overwhelming. At least it is to me.
So AJ, did you guys have any prisoners that were set free from the jail out there because of COVID?
They weren't technically in our jail, but I know that there was a whole big to-do where the state's attorney out here was pissed off at Governor Pritzker, because typically somebody who's, say it's a rape, say it's a violent crime, something like that, when that prisoner is going to be released, the local state's attorney will notify the victim. And my understanding of it was that Governor Pritzker released these people and did not tell our state's attorney, so she wasn't able to notify the victims or the family of victims until after it was in the news.
So do you think that the release of the prisoners had something to do with the increase in looting and crime in the city?
Not necessarily. Just because it seemed oddly specific, the amount or the crimes that the prisoners that were being let go, they all seem to be violent offenders, but I don't think it's played into the violence at all. I think a lot of it is based on just the election.
I read, this has got nothing to do with necessarily crime, but even like divorce attorneys, not necessarily going through with the divorce, but divorce attorneys were on an uptick because just the husbands and wives being together, when it was that lockdown, big time lockdown, was putting strain on a relationship. Because most of the time, people are not together that often. You may be in the evening and then you go to sleep, blah, 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 or you're together on the weekend. So just in general, being, there's a lot of factors, I think what I'm getting at, that may have increased either crime or just disturbances. Let's put it that way. Maybe something that doesn't fall under the umbrella of an actual crime. This was an unprecedented thing that we've gone through, with this COVID across the country. So to my knowledge, I don't recall ever having this happen, certainly not in my lifetime, I guess. So yeah, it put a lot of people under psychological distress, I would think. On that take, AJ, maybe it's dying down now, but did you notice, you mentioned earlier in the broadcast, a lot of domestics, but that's generally speaking, I heard domestic calls are always pretty much number one. But did you notice an increase in that specifically when all this COVID quarantine hit?
Not necessarily,
Yeah.
but that's speaking from my small scope. I mean, we also, the city that I work for, we have an extremely high unemployment rate. We have an extremely high mental illness population. So I don't necessarily know how many people were even really impacted by the lockdown, just because of the fact that our unemployment is so high and the fact that there's a lot of people that are living off of Social Security because they're mentally ill.
Makes sense. See, we dig deeper now and we get more answers. Yeah, it's and again, when you're looking at a city like Chicago or the spur right around there, suburbs that are right around there. Yeah, it's a toll. I don't know what the unemployment figures are. I do know that Chicago still has places that are, closed. This is nothing to do with Governor Pritzker, but it's Mayor Lightfoot's decision, like some bars that don't have a liquor license, or that don't have a food license still are not allowed to be open. Um, that's, devastating. So, the unemployment through that alone would have to be high. Uh, yeah, it's just, like me, I'm not coaching. Nobody wants to directly train. It's difficult. It's a hard, this COVID really messed with a lot of people. I mean, no doubt. But eventually this will all pass. And then we got to see once the dust settles, where are we at as a society here? It's yet to be seen.
So AJ, what's some of the craziest calls you've taken?
Well, I mean, define crazy. Most of the calls that I take are to normal standards, they're insane. Um, it, the ones that I haven't even necessarily taken, I was there one night when my coworker, I was sitting right next to him, he took a call from a lady who had just stabbed her 7-year-old child to death in the driveway. And she called on herself. Thankfully, I didn't have to take that. I mean, there's a lot of them that are pretty crazy. There's so many that I've forgotten a ton of them.
Is there any that stand out?
Yeah, there's one that comes to mind immediately. So we have a methadone clinic, and they called one time saying that there was they wanted a welfare check done on one of their clients because he was showing up on a day for treatment when it wasn't his day for treatment. And it said that he was just kind of talking crazy, not making a whole lot of sense. Well, I was on the phone with her, and this client of theirs said that he was being chased by vampires and he's going to go kill some vampires. And while I'm on the phone, he decided to go run over to his truck. He grabbed a stake and a hammer and took off running.
Wow.
So we
What's really crazy about that is you work day shift, which would be impossible then.
Yeah, the vampires are sleeping, aren't they?
Yeah, supposed to be. But then I spoke with the officer that ended up taking the report, and when they got there, he had like I want to say it was either a GMC Sonoma or a Chevy S10. It was one of those little two-seater, smaller pickup trucks. The whole passenger side of his truck was filled with cloves of garlic.
Oh, Jesus.
That's the same with Tony though, but he's Italian, so.
Yeah. Should get a job working at a pizzeria with all the garlic. I love garlic, man.
Yeah. So
Yeah, that's wild.
yeah.
Vampire.
Yeah, he's a vampire slayer.
Yeah.
Oh man,
Damn.
that is crazy.
I just can't fathom, in big cities, think like New York or even get out of our country, go to like Mexico City or Tokyo or something where there's even more people. The stories, that people in the society like you are, the position that you hold or other positions similar, ER doctors or nurses, what they see. I can imagine what the ER sees, because a lot of that, you don't have to report it, right? You go in, something silly happened, and that would be, oh man, I can't imagine the stories that these people have to say,
It's got to be tough though, keeping your spirits up. Like you said, you've been doing this for 10 years. And I would think, I mean, how long do people usually last on the job? I mean, do you see people going the full, making it to retirement, or is there some burnout? Because I would think, you've got to be amped for that 12 hours. I mean, it's, kind of, emergency after emergency. I mean, it's not like you have any downtime. And then at the end of the day, like you said, that stabbing of a child, that would mess me up for weeks. I would be carrying that, and I think, I've heard of other people who have other jobs, whether it's in healthcare or whatever, where, just the cumulative effect, of seeing, like in some ways we're lucky, those of us who are not in that, is that we see a very, I don't know if it's filtered, but like you have like kind of a very distilled, all you get to see for 12 hours a day are the bad sides, and the danger. And it's got to be hard not to be, how do you avoid getting paranoid and, all the different effects that I could imagine could come from that.
Um, Everybody has their own methods. It is. It's like you said. It is very mentally taxing. Most everybody. I mean, 911 specifically nationwide has very, very high turnover. I know that like my department, we're going to be short staffed forever. We have a 13% success rate
Wow.
for new hires of making it through training. Some of that has to do with the types of calls, and there's a lot of people, like you said, it is pretty much a filtered perspective, on what's actually going on, because the news is only going to tell you about the big things that are going on, the ones that are, and sometimes they don't even tell you that. It's I know everybody goes through a period. Everybody who makes it goes through some kind of weird period where, they're trying to figure out that balance, and they find some kind of vice. To be honest with you, there's a lot of them that, whether it's a prescription, whether it's they go home and drink, some people use the gym, which is, one of the healthier alternatives. And I think that's the way that most things are moving now, but it does definitely give you a different perspective on life and perspective on society. Everybody in my profession pretty much we all got dark senses of humor, things like that. So on top of the calls and things like that, you've also got short staffing and a lot of mandatory overtime, which honestly takes more of a toll than the calls. I've always had the perspective of, it's not my emergency. As sad as some of the things might be, and there is, no matter what, no matter who you are, no matter what you're doing, anything that involves kids and animals is going to affect you more than anything else. A lot of the times, you take a shooting victim or whatever the case is, 9 times out of 10, what did you do to cause this? I can't say it like that, and I don't think, what did you do to cause this, but how did you get yourself in this scenario where you're finding yourself shot? Because a lot of it's house parties and things like that. It's not, you got caught in the middle of a drive-by, and that does happen. But I don't know. I tend to separate myself from a lot of it, but kids and animals will affect you differently. Like I could tell you that night that woman stabbed her son to death, the entire 911 center was dead silent for the rest of the night. Like everybody was impacted by that. And nobody really spoke. We just pressed forward and did our jobs and went home.
I have a question for you. Did you have to, or do all dispatchers go through, let's say, the equivalent of an EMT training, some sort of, Red Cross, any sort of training like that?
Yep. So we all have to be CPR certified, and then it's emergency medical dispatch, which is the certification that we have to get, and it's essentially, you don't have to. It's not to the standards of EMT, like it.
Okay.
It not at all. I've already done that, but a lot of us do have backgrounds in EMT, fire service, or some kind of police service, so it helps. But EMD, essentially every single department is going to have a different EMD provider, I guess. I'm not sure how to say that. Some I know that there's one company called PowerPhone, and they provide books. So it's like a flip book. So say it's a allergic reaction. There's a tab for allergic reaction, and it leads you right down into the questioning.
Okay.
And so that it kind of provides that blanket of protection, you'd say, for people that some people do get stressed out about handling an emergency like that, and it kind of keeps them on track with their line of questioning and then providing CPR and things like that. It gives you word by word instructions.
Good. Yeah, I would assume that you had to have some sort of that, especially if somebody's calling and, in hysterics, not from a violent crime, but yeah, they may be having a heart attack or they accidentally ingested poison or whatever. That's good to know.
So I got a question. I was at church a couple weeks ago, and the priest was telling a story that he had two cops come to him, wanted to talk to him in private, and they responded to a call with a person that they believe was just showing paranormal activity, and they think was completely possessed, and they were so disturbed they had to come and talk to the priest and get it off their chest. So I was wondering, have you or like any cops in your department dealt with any kind of paranormal activity like that?
Not to my knowledge. Most of the paranormal stuff, kinds of calls that we get, are just the people that are crazy. My department's actually pretty short staffed overall as far as police and 911. So I don't know if they've even had time to delve that far into it. I think a lot of the times, what can be deemed as paranormal, which I don't, Nico, as you know, I believe in very, very much so. But I think a lot of that tends to be drug induced or a mental illness.
You do run into the occasional vampire, but but beyond that, I did have a question too. So just in general, like what would help, what advice would you give to, the general citizen of like, what things should they, I don't know, be aware of or try and communicate when they're calling? And what are the most important pieces of information? Like, is it their address or know where they're at? Or what kinds of things would you say, wow, this would really make it go smoother for them if they gave us this information?
Where you're at, hands down, is where you're at, because the rest of the stuff, the whys, the whats, all that stuff, I don't really need to know that. But if I don't know where you are, I don't know where to send anybody to help you.
Well, here, I had this incident happen to me in Chicago. So this is a Chicago thing. I was a witness to a pretty bad car accident. I was not involved in it. I saw it out where I was. And I called 911. And I could tell immediately that one of the persons in the car was in need of help. And the dispatcher refused to send paramedics until that victim, would ask for it. I said, this person can't ask for it. This person's unconscious. I was not impressed. That upset me. I was not impressed with that at all. Is that a standard reply for your department?
No, not at all. And it's dictated by department policy. My department's policy is if anybody asks for an ambulance, they get an ambulance.
Okay, good. Yeah, so this might have been, and I can't believe that this is a Chicago policy. I just can't believe it. I got to think this was a follow-up on the dispatcher's part. I mean, I got verbal, man. I raised my voice. I'm like, this was unbelievable. And then some lady grabbed my phone, another witness, I guess, and she talked, and I walked away because this person was in trouble. The guy in the car was in trouble. Yeah, well, that's good to know that at least in your department, they'll send out the ambulance. And then I would assume it's up to the person to either accept treatment or not treatment,
Yep. And that's, to my knowledge, that's pretty much the national standard, that if you ask for an ambulance, you get an ambulance.
Yeah.
There are certain things where you don't get an ambulance. Like most people don't realize, and this also varies by department, but like my department, for instance, when somebody calls, hey, my brother's having some kind of bipolar break and he needs to go down to the hospital for an evaluation, it's actually the police that do that transport here and not the fire, not an ambulance that comes to pick them up because of the fact that, they could tend to get violent and things like that. And, to me, I don't understand it, but that's the policies that we send a police officer. So that's the one time where just because you request an ambulance, you don't get an ambulance. But to me, that's a huge liability on any department if they have a policy that says that if somebody's asking for an ambulance, you say no. Like you're taxpayer funded. How can you say no?
Good. Yeah. So I just got to throw this on to the dispatcher at that point because, or whatever, the operator, 911 operator, because it was just, I sometimes wonder, this was whatever happened to the guy, I'm sure he was alive at the scene. I mean, he wasn't deceased, but, I wonder, was he crippled or, whatever ended up happening to the guy? I'll never know. I don't even know the man's name, but, that's pretty interesting stuff. Well, now, I guess this would fall under the category of mental illness. Someone who doesn't like Philadelphia cheesesteak, because Joe just has a problem with Philadelphia cheesecake or cheesesteak. I would assume that's probably mental illness. If you got a 911 call about that, like an argument over Philadelphia cheesesteak, I'm thinking mental illness.
It could be. It could also just be a disagreement.
Okay. Well, we know Joe, so we're going to lean to the
What
side.
a reasonable person sounds like, Tony. You should have AJ on here a little bit more frequently.
Yeah, you like that at a
Get some balance.
distancing. You can talk to me like that. Yeah, don't worry. We'll get on the mat again. Um, let's hope, right?
Let's hope.
All right. You never know, man. Jesus, no, but it'll all. But even like with me, getting back to this CPR training and all of that. I did all of that multimedia first aid. I think a lot of martial art instructors, in particular, need to do that. They need to be aware of a lot of things. And I'm big on psychology, and I studied psychology, and I'm not a psychologist by any chance, stretch of imagination, but enough to assist me in my coaching. And, I guess we're counselors as well. At least a good coach should be a counselor as well. And in a way, with you're doing dispatching or taking these frantic calls, sometimes I would have to assume you have to be a counselor. You have to, I would think, no matter how gloomy you may think the incident is, you have to kind of be reassuring and be calming to the person to bring them down so they don't go into hysterics. Correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I know that but it just depends on the person. We're not trained one single way to do it. For instance, my technique, I don't think I've ever raised my voice on the phone. I just use my same monotone tone. And, if somebody's hysterical and they're not answering a question, I just keep repeating the question and they'll answer it. Calm breeds calm, chaos breeds chaos. So if you're taking somebody who's in a chaotic situation and you just keep remaining calm, they will come down to your level eventually.
Mm-hmm. Good. Yeah.
So AJ, when I was doing EMT school, something I learned was that I was unaware of is that there's actually a lot of violence towards EMTs and paramedics when they're responding to these, gang shootings and stuff like that. Do you guys see any the EMTs and paramedics being attacked when they respond to these violent calls out by you?
No, typically with us, if there's any kind of violent call like that, the police are going to. So it gets annoying as a police dispatcher that our fire department is overly cautious. So they ask for the police on a lot of the things that they do. Good for them. I understand the firefighter safety aspect of it, but most of the times and I don't understand this perspective either, but I can't say anything about it. A lot of the times the fire department will stage and they'll be waiting down the block and wait for the police to tell them that the scene's secure. And
That's what I learned in the school. They were saying they have to wait for the cops because they would respond to these, like, let's say they respond to someone who got shot, and as soon as they go out to help them, the perpetrators would shoot at the actual EMTs and paramedics that are trying to help them.
yeah, and thankfully we don't have too much of that, even though we've got violent crimes and things like that. Even as far as the police go, up until recently, there hasn't been a whole lot of targeting of the first responders.
Do you guys see a lot of violence towards the cops?
It depends. It not so much, and I mean it's one of the things that I was able to give the city I work for a lot of credit in for a long time is that, I'm trying to remember, I made it 5-6 years into my career before we had an officer that was killed in the line of duty. Then after that first one, then there was another one. We hit a U.S. Marshal. That was an incident that I worked, who was killed at a hotel here in town. But aside from that, not really. I mean, these protesters and everything that's going on with that, they don't seem to be targeting the police officers. They seem to be targeting a reaction from the police officers. They're looking for they try to bait the officers into taking any kind of corrective action on them so that they can get that emotional response when they post the edited video of it.
So Joe, let me ask you this. In your experience, because you were raised in Chicago, and how old were you when you left the city?
Well, initially about 18, right after high school, I went out to California. And then I moved back into the north side of the city, and I was probably there from like the age of 20 to like 33 or something like that. So most of my time was in the city.
Okay. I can tell you guys, because I'm the oldest one here, and I've said this to many people. Basically, even though I was born in the 60s, I was a child of the 70s. That's when I kind of grew up and graduated high school in the early 80s, 82. Overall, crime was worse, much worse back then, okay, than it is now. There's just, to me, no comparison. And yes, I was raised in a bad neighborhood. I get it. But there was just like a lot of bad neighborhoods back when I was growing up. I mean, the whole thing, no matter where I went, it was kind of shitty. And in general, and I can remember vividly when you watch movies from the 70s, they look at all the crime-ridden New York or this or that, all these cities, crime, the Death Wish movies, all that jazz. So, I take things that are happening now in a way with a grain of salt, and I believe the FBI crime statistics back all this up. There was a lot of crime back in the 70s. So now, yes, there may be a slight uptick compared to what we were used to, but I guess this crime I believe, and I should have researched this before we came on, but in the 2000s is when it just seemed to start to dip. Crime started to take a steady decline. And again, you guys are probably too young to remember this, but we probably weren't even born then. But yeah, believe me, there's a difference. So I'm asking Joe specifically because he's closer to my age and being in the city. I got to think that you had a taste of some bad times in the late 70s or 80s in the city, right?
Well, and it's funny because in a city the size of Chicago too, like, I mean, I'm kind of aware of the trend you're speaking of. So, and just because, like if you're kind of paying attention to politics and news, like around the gun debate, let's say, the long-term trends, those statistics come up. So, obviously we see things like school shootings or mass shootings, and it seems like it's increasing. But when you look overall, and again, who knows if these numbers are cooked or whatnot, but if you look at the overall, like death by homicide, even though we have a high rate here in the U.S. compared to maybe a lot of other developed countries, we are significantly lower than we were in the 70s. So I mean, it's not just a kind of a subjective impression, but I think the numbers bear that out. That yeah, during the 60s and 70s, there was a big peak of violence, and it's hard to say what's brought that down. I mean, there's so many factors with that, and I wouldn't even begin to be an expert on that. But to your earlier question about my experience is, a city the size of Chicago, even though crime overall would be higher, like as a kid you kind of stick to your neighborhood, and so it's how was my neighborhood, so in some ways I felt my neighborhood declined from the 70s compared to like the 90s, and a lot of that just had to do with so many, factors that, going on with the city and the shifting dynamics. So when I was growing up, it was blue collar. So there was just kind of what I would call standard American violence, groups of kids beating each other up or chasing you and stuff, but it wasn't the, what I would call, like, I wasn't in the inner city or ghetto kind of neighborhoods where like real violence was happening, where people were being gunned down. I mean, there was always a vague threat of violence, but it wasn't anything that I think a lot of kids just growing up in America would, from, like I said, I wouldn't call it like the official gangs of the city, but just like groups of kids, attacking each other and things like that. Kind of the normal level of, I could say young man violence growing up. But things got a little worse in the neighborhood I grew up in later on. And that's just like I said, so things are moving up and down depending which neighborhood you're in. But overall, I've also heard that, violent crime in America has been on a steady decline for a long time. And that's a good thing.
Well, one of the other issues that gets sometimes lost in this is like when I grew up, we had a total of, well, at the most, at one point, we had 6 television stations: ABC, CBS, NBC, and then we had PBS, which was 4, and then we had 2 UHF channels, which were just local things, and then at one point, we only had 1 of those. Now you have so much news, internet, 24-hour cycles. I mean, there's over reporting. Okay. So my point being, a lot of things happened back in our day and before my time. They just didn't have enough time to broadcast it. I mean, you weren't running 24-hour news shows. You're lucky if you had 30 minutes or an hour a day of news. Okay. Growing up. So how much can you cram in? That's the thing. And now with the internet, I mean, for example, I never heard of anything that happened at Topeka, Kansas, unless it was, super tragic. Now you can read about it when you go on the internet. It just pops up on your homepage or one of the news aggregates or something. So I think a lot of us get overwhelmed with it. It's information overload. And I know my friend Vince and I, we were talking that we take breaks from this. We just can't even go anywhere near this because it's just too much. It's just over and over and over the stories. Because yeah, if you have a news agency that's, hunkering out information, you've got to try to find it wherever you can, no matter how minute it may be or no matter how major it may be. So I think that skews not necessarily statistics, but it skews our mentality about it, because no matter what, none of us were used to hearing this much information back in the 70s or 80s because we just didn't have the outlets to give it to us. So, I have to take breaks from it. Otherwise you just go nuts.
Yeah, and to touch on that too, now that there is 24/7 news coverage all the time, the news coverage itself has taken a huge hit because it's not about who's getting the story most accurately. It's about who's first.
Correct. Yeah.
So there's, and most people, and I think there's psychology that goes into that. And I think a lot of them feed into that too, where, once somebody has a first impression, it's hard to change that first impression. So it's a dangerous thing that they're doing with these 24/7 news coverage where, oh, man shot by police officer, or, they put it out. The one that I'm thinking of specifically is Jacob Blake, one of the more recent ones. And it's, oh, unarmed man shot by police officer. Then they trickle out the truth that he was armed with a knife, that he sexually assaulted a woman, that he said that he had a gun in the car and he was getting in that car that was filled with a bunch of kids. The fact that he was tased, the fact that he fought off 3 officers, and, then all of a sudden the whole story as a whole is a whole different meaning than what it was first presented as.
On another subject, and really, you just mentioned something, the word tased. I would like to eventually, if we can, get a guest on here who is an expert on tasers because, they used to bill it as less than lethal. As we know, tasers can kill and have killed, but we're also hearing a lot, like you just said, that this taser didn't work. We're having a lot of failures with the taser, which now escalates things. And I'm not putting you on the spot, AJ, but I'm just saying this is a good thing that you brought that up because it clicked in my head. Because I'd like to get some clarity on this. What's going on with these tasers? And you see it. I mean, you can see video clips of people getting tased, and it's not stopping them. And then you also know people who've gotten tased, and it's killed them. So that's probably a subject we should touch on eventually, Joe and Nico. I'd like to see if we could get somebody who's an expert on this and explain this phenomenon to me.
Yeah, I know somebody that got tased. He was a pro fighter, big, really healthy guy, and he got into a fight, and he was under the influence of alcohol, and he was very upset at the time, and the cops tased him with the prong taser, and he just ripped it right out, and they were like in shock and very fearful, but they calmed him down and stuff, but it didn't knock him down, and it didn't really phase him at all. And I don't know if it was the alcohol or that he's just a physical phenomenon. He's like a big, strong guy, super fit, but taser didn't affect him, and that was probably their most powerful taser.
Yeah, a lot of it has to do with the prongs, because if the prongs don't hit you accurately, you're not going to get a good connection for the electric shock. Now, same being said, if the prongs hit in a wrong way, it's going to zap your heart, and your heart's going to stop. That's where, it's less than lethal. A lot of the times those are drug induced too. I know, like PCP, for instance, people tend to have a higher tolerance to it. So they'll keep getting tased until eventually, it throws off their heart rhythm and their heart stops. But tasers they're good in certain circumstances, but they're not an ideal weapon. It should not be, as it is where everybody's, well, why don't you just tase them? It's like, because you have to have near perfect conditions for the taser in order for it to work properly.
Is there a certain type of clothing that would inhibit the taser from, making a good connection?
Friend?
Yeah, I mean, I would assume if you're wearing thicker type clothing during the winter time, for instance, it'd be kind of pointless because it's not going to pierce the jacket and the shirt and the layers.
Do your police have like a protocol to follow when somebody's getting out of hand and you got to use violence? Like, is it, first try to use no weapons and restrain them and then escalate to the club or the taser? And how does that work?
I don't know their policy specifically, but there are very strict policies that they're supposed to follow. And I know that, like lethal force, for instance, even just physical force, there's, especially with how the spotlight has been on police brutality and things like that, it's gotten stricter and stricter. And I know that there's definitely been a few times where guys that I'm buddies with would have been justified in using lethal force, and they haven't. Thankfully, it's turned out okay for the most part. But yeah, I don't know specifically their policies, but I do know that their policies are strict, and they will hang a guy or girl. They'll persecute the hell out of them if they don't follow those policies.
Do you think it would be beneficial for all the police to have martial arts training?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I know most of them do on their own time, but I think that should be a standard, and start them young, hit them in the academy.
Yeah, but it's got the right stuff. You know, there's a lot of training out there that's just going to get the cop in trouble, going to force a police officer, if he was properly trained, to detain a person, whereas if he's improperly trained, will lead him to use deadly force. I've seen it because I've worked with police for one. And secondly, when I used to train out of Triton College, they would bring in the recruits and train them there. And it was literally ridiculous. The training was so bad that and we were training simultaneously. And the instructor was like, well, you know, this won't work against those types of guys, meaning us. But their training, in essence, was pretty much follow my verbal commands. Okay. And if, you know, you're not following those commands, the techniques that they were shown were woefully inadequate. And I've talked to several police officers off the record, you know, about this. You know, like if you're not rightly trained, you're better off not even physically engaging. All your training is going to do is either going to get your ass beat or is going to force you to pull a weapon, whereas you may not have had to go that far, you know, if you didn't try to open up a can of worms here. So I'm very adamant. That's my line of work here. That's where I'm very adamant that so much training out there is just not proper for street self-defense. It just is going to get you in it's going to get you in a lot of water, a lot of hot water. So yeah, I do agree with you, AJ. They all should be trained, but they should be trained, you know, appropriately, properly. And now, especially many organizations, and this was like this in the past as well, where they were barring chokeholds. They're doing it again with the neck restraints. And when you're properly trained, no problem. I mean, I'll take you out without having to put you out. So I just wish more police officers, you know, would seek out quality training and separate the sport from reality. I know one guy, I won't mention his name, but you know, he showed me a video. He wanted to train police officers, and I'm like, look, man, your techniques won't work. Number one, look at how you're dressed. You're in a pair of sweatpants and you're doing all these crazy moves. You have to understand a police officer is going to be suited up. You know, they're going to be wearing special, you know, bulletproof vests, this or that, holsters, guns, whatever. Many tactics that we could use when you're normally dressed like we are right now. You're not going to pull that off, you know, under those restrictions. And these are just things that people have to take into consideration, instructors. And sadly, many of them don't. Rant over.
Yeah, I seen that in New York. I guess apparently they're banning the use of like any restraining techniques by the cops, and a lot of people are saying, well, this is just going to increase the cops' use of violence because they can't hold them down, they can't, you know, lay on the guy. All they can basically do is hit them with their stick, you know. So it's actually going to make things worse. But I think the problem is not the restraining. The problem is people need to be trained on how to restrain someone properly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's my point.
Well, hey guys, we're getting close to the time to wrap up, but this is gonna end. I mean, are there any closing thoughts or advice? AJ, do you have anything that, like, words you'd want to get out there on, you know, general civilians, or things that you'd want people to know?
I mean, overall, I think I've touched on this again. If you need to call 911, know where you're at, and don't judge anything that you see in the media until the full story's out.
It's good advice.
Yeah, I want to thank you for being on, AJ. It's very enlightening, and you're another one of the unsung heroes. You know, people talk about police or nurses or whatever, fire, and you know, many times you are the first line of defense or help, you know, 911. Let's call 911. So, you know, my hat's off to you, man. It's a thankless job many times. So I'm here to publicly thank you for what you do and everyone else that does that as well.
Appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, we'll have to have you back. That was really good.
Yeah.
Anytime.
All right, guys. Have a good one.
See you guys next time.
All right, have a good one, guys.